Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as I sat at the table, staring into the dark liquid, my mind running through everything I'd noticed over the past few months. If someone had told me 5 years ago that I'd be questioning my wife's faithfulness, I would have laughed it off. But now, here I was, piecing together moments, silences, and slip-ups. And the sinking feeling that something was wrong kept growing. Claire and I had been married for a decade, building a life and family I'd once believed was rock solid. We had 2 wonderful kids, a comfortable home, and a future that felt stable, even exciting. Sure, we had our ups and downs, as any married couple does. But it never crossed my mind that infidelity would sneak in, disrupting everything. The first signs were subtle, easy to dismiss as my imagination getting the better of me. At first, I noticed her distant expressions, as if her mind was somewhere else, someplace I couldn't reach. I'd come home from work, eager to talk about my day, and find her staring out the window, barely noticing I was there. When I asked her what was on her mind, she'd smile and say, "Oh, nothing important," and we'd go back to our usual routine. Then came the phone calls. They started out like any normal part of life, but soon, she became unusually guarded with her phone. She'd never had a reason to hide anything from me before, but suddenly, her phone was always with her, even when she went to the bathroom. And she'd spend a lot of time texting or talking quietly when she thought I wasn't paying attention. One evening, while we were having dinner with some friends, Claire's phone buzzed. Her face changed, a flicker of something, maybe guilt or surprise, and she quickly silenced the phone without checking the screen. Later that night, after the kids were in bed, I asked her if everything was okay. She laughed it off, saying it was a work message she didn't want to deal with. But something in her tone felt forced. I tried to ignore it. But once I had noticed the change in her, I couldn't unsee it. Her work trips started becoming more frequent, each one a little more convenient than the last. "It's just a busy season," she'd explain, sounding almost rehearsed. "You know how it is with my job." And every time, she'd pack her bags with a quiet excitement that made me feel uneasy. One day, she mentioned a new client, Derek, who'd recently come into the picture. She talked about him in a way that didn't seem unusual, except for a faint glimmer in her eyes. I dismissed it, though the name stuck in my head, and I reminded myself that it was natural for her to connect with colleagues. We'd been together long enough that I thought I knew her well enough to trust her. But I noticed her phone again, how she shielded the screen as if she were hiding something. Weeks passed. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But I couldn't shake it. One evening, Claire was unusually chatty, going on about some conference she'd be attending in Virginia. I listened carefully, but there was a hollowness to her words. She kept glancing at me, as though gauging my reaction. As soon as she mentioned Virginia, that familiar name, Derek, popped back into my mind. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Claire slept beside me. The usual comfort of her presence felt strange, foreign. A heavy silence pressed down on me, amplifying every thought, every suspicion. Was I going mad? Was I turning into the paranoid husband, the one who suspects without cause? I told myself I needed proof, real proof, not just my imagination running wild. A few days later, she left for another trip. I watched her drive away, my mind buzzing. Once I was sure she was gone, I decided to take a chance and check the phone bill. It was something I'd never done before, trusting her implicitly, never thinking I'd need to cross that line. But as I scrolled through the list of calls and texts, a number with a Virginia area code stood out. It was everywhere, at all hours of the day, late at night, during weekends when she said she was working late. My stomach churned. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my neck as I took note of the number. Who was this? I knew it wasn't anyone in her family or close circle of friends. I wanted to believe it was work-related, but the frequency of the calls told a different story. Instead of confronting her right then and there, I resolved to dig deeper. I needed to be sure, to gather enough to know the truth. The next weekend, as she was packing for another business trip, I watched her closely, taking in every move, every twitch. Her hands shook slightly as she folded her clothes, her gaze flitting around the room like she was avoiding mine. I waited until she had left, and then, as though on autopilot, I went to her dresser. I didn't know what I was looking for, but a gut feeling drove me. After sifting through her clothes, I found a small box hidden in the back of her drawer. Inside was a bracelet, one I had never seen before. It was a beautiful piece, expensive, with an engraving that read, "For C, with love, D." My chest tightened, and a wave of anger washed over me. Derek, I thought, feeling the weight of the discovery settle in my gut. That night, I couldn't sleep. The name Derek echoed in my mind, over and over, mingling with the memories of her recent absences, the guarded glances, the whispers. All the things I'd ignored or brushed aside now came together like pieces of a puzzle, a picture I didn't want to see. The next morning, I greeted her with a forced smile as she returned home, pretending not to notice the faint perfume that wasn't hers or the way she avoided my eyes. As the days passed, I continued to observe her carefully, quietly gathering details, building my case. I began to plan, mentally preparing myself for what was to come. It was only a matter of time. The morning after Claire's return from her latest business trip, I felt like I was moving through a fog. The smell of her perfume, an unfamiliar, floral scent, clung to the air in our bedroom. It was faint but unmistakable. I lay still, watching her sleep, wondering how many more times I'd have to pretend I didn't see the signs, pretend that I believed her stories. But I knew the truth now, or at least enough of it to stop ignoring the reality I was living in. When she finally woke up, she smiled at me, stretching and murmuring something about how she missed the kids. Her casual tone, the practiced ease with which she settled back into our home, made my stomach turn. I managed to smile back and agreed we should take the kids out that weekend. We spent that morning like nothing was wrong, me making breakfast, her chatting with the kids, as if everything was as it should be. But I was already in a different place, mentally preparing myself for what I'd need to do. That bracelet I'd found in her drawer, with its inscription from D, was as clear as any proof could be. The words she hadn't said were all there, stamped into that piece of jewelry. I knew I needed to confront her, but I also knew I needed to plan it carefully. That night, after putting the kids to bed, I suggested we watch a movie together. She looked at me, a bit surprised, then nodded, probably relieved that I seemed normal. I put on some mindless action movie, but I barely followed it, my mind whirring with questions. I glanced at her, noticing how calm she seemed, almost comfortable. It struck me then how well she must have rationalized everything to herself. She'd buried whatever guilt she might have felt deep enough that it barely surfaced. When the movie ended, I turned to her and asked about her recent trip. She looked surprised, maybe even nervous, and I almost regretted bringing it up. But I needed to hear her lie. I needed to understand how far she'd go to cover it up. "Oh, just the usual," she replied with a forced laugh. "Meetings, dinners, and endless presentations. It was pretty exhausting, actually." I nodded, pretending to be interested. "So, who all went? Did you see anyone you knew?" She hesitated for a second too long. "Oh, just some colleagues from the company. No one you'd know." There it was, the little stammer that gave her away. My suspicion hardened into certainty. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. I had to bide my time. Over the next week, I kept up the facade, playing the role of the oblivious husband while secretly setting things into motion. I spoke with a lawyer, who laid out my options, though I kept things vague enough to avoid too many raised eyebrows. I didn't tell him about Derek or the bracelet or my suspicions, I kept it professional, just gathering information. I needed to make sure that when I took action, I'd be prepared, not caught up in a messy battle with loose ends. One evening, I decided to check her emails. I'd never snooped before, not once in all our years together, but now it felt necessary. I needed answers, more than what she'd given me with her thinly veiled lies. When she went out to run an errand, I sat down at her computer, my heart pounding as I pulled up her inbox. Most of her messages were exactly what you'd expect: work emails, bills, reminders. But I knew what I was looking for, and I soon found it. An email from Derek W. with the subject line, "Can't wait for next time." I clicked it open, and as I read his words, casual but intimate, filled with the kind of warmth that she hadn't shown me in months, I felt my grip on the mouse tighten. Derek was real, and he wasn't just a name. He was a presence in her life, someone she had brought into our marriage. My thoughts spiraled as I read through more messages, piecing together a relationship that had clearly been going on for months, maybe longer. There were shared photos, inside jokes, plans for future trips. The depth of their connection was clear, and the betrayal felt like a weight on my chest. When she returned home, I forced myself to act normal, even though I was seething inside. The contrast between the person she pretended to be around me and the version of her that lived in those emails was too much. I started spending more time in the garage, tinkering with whatever I could find, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind from spiraling. A few nights later, when the kids were in bed, I decided it was time to take a different approach. I didn't want to confront her directly, but I wanted her to know that something was off, that her behavior wasn't going unnoticed. "So, Claire," I said, keeping my tone casual, "I was thinking maybe we should go on a weekend trip. Just the two of us. You know, to get away and reconnect." Her expression shifted, and for a split second, I saw the guilt flicker in her eyes. "Oh, that sounds lovely," she said slowly, "but I'm swamped at work right now. Maybe next month." The excuses were piling up, and I could see right through her. But I smiled and nodded, letting her believe I'd bought her story. Meanwhile, I was making plans of my own. One evening, after she had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bracelet once more, turning it over in my hand. I couldn't get the inscription out of my mind. "For C, with love, D." It was a promise, a claim. He had a place in her life that was supposed to be mine, and it made my blood boil. I thought about everything I'd given her over the years, the stability, the home, the love. I'd put her and our family above everything, and this was how she repaid me. It was one thing to cheat, but to create a life with someone else while lying to me every step of the way. That was more than I could bear. My mind drifted to the day I'd proposed to her all those years ago. We'd been so young and in love, or at least I thought we had been. Back then, everything had seemed so simple. I'd never imagined a future where she'd betray me like this, where I'd be sitting alone in our kitchen, plotting my next move. I took a deep breath, setting the bracelet back in its box. There was no going back now. I couldn't look at her the same way, couldn't let her think she'd fooled me forever. I had waited long enough, and I was done pretending. The next morning, I awoke with a cold resolve, a sense of purpose that steadied me. Today, I would take another step in taking back control of my life, and this time, I wouldn't let my emotions get in the way. I moved quietly through the house, getting the kids ready for school, exchanging pleasantries with Claire like nothing was wrong, while inside, my mind was focused, calculating my next move. Once the kids were out of the house and Claire had left for work, I took a deep breath and decided it was time to gather concrete evidence. It wasn't enough to know, I needed something undeniable, irrefutable proof of her betrayal. My mind raced through the options: phone records, emails, maybe even a private investigator. I wanted to be ready for any confrontation, any denial, anything she might throw at me to twist the situation. But most of all, I needed it for myself. I couldn't move forward without knowing I had everything laid out in front of me, no room for doubt. I sat down at her computer again, this time prepared to dig deeper. I knew it was risky, but the need to find the truth was stronger than any fear of getting caught. I skimmed through her emails first, rereading messages from Derek that were intimate enough to hint at their closeness but careful not to be explicit. Each line felt like a slap, confirming everything I'd suspected. Still, there was a part of me that needed more. After combing through emails, I checked her phone records again. The same Virginia number popped up repeatedly, often late at night or during her so-called work trips. I found myself tracing the patterns of her calls, noting the times, the lengths, anything that might help solidify my case. The deeper I went, the more my anger simmered, a slow burn that kept me going, kept me focused. I spent the rest of the day researching, diving into legal forums, reading articles about divorce settlements and custody arrangements. I wanted to know where I stood, to understand my rights, so that when the time came, I'd be prepared. I found comfort in the facts, in knowing I could approach this logically, even if my heart was broken. When Claire got home that evening, I tried to act as normally as possible. It was surreal, sharing dinner with her, listening to her recount her day as if nothing was wrong. I studied her, noticing the little things I'd missed before, the way she glanced at her phone every now and then, the distant look in her eyes when I asked her about work. It was like watching a stranger, someone I didn't know or recognize, and yet, someone I had loved for over a decade. Over the next few days, I continued my quiet investigation, gathering bits and pieces, mentally cataloging each detail. I decided to check our shared bank account and credit card statements. I was half hoping I wouldn't find anything out of the ordinary, but I knew better. And sure enough, there were charges for hotel stays in places she had never mentioned, dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of. Every discovery felt like another cut, deepening the wound that her betrayal had opened. But it also strengthened my resolve, gave me the confirmation I needed to keep moving forward. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I decided to confront her indirectly, to see if she'd confess or give any sign of guilt. I poured myself a drink, then poured one for her, sitting down beside her on the couch. "You know, Claire," I began, my tone calm but firm, "I've been thinking a lot about us lately. About our marriage." She looked up, surprised, maybe a little nervous. "Oh. Is everything okay?" "I don't know," I replied, letting a hint of sadness seep into my voice. "It feels like we've been drifting apart. I just wanted to know if there's anything you want to tell me. Anything on your mind?" Her face registered a brief flicker of panic, but she quickly masked it, offering a reassuring smile. "No, nothing's wrong. It's just been a busy few months, you know. Work's been hectic, and I guess I've been a little distracted." I nodded, forcing myself to look vulnerable, hoping she might open up. But she didn't. She just reached for my hand, giving it a squeeze. "We're fine," she said softly. "We're just in a bit of a rut. Maybe we could plan a weekend away, just the two of us." The irony of her suggestion stung, but I played along, nodding in agreement. "Maybe you're right. A weekend away could be good for us." After that, I withdrew. I didn't push further. I knew she wasn't going to confess. I'd given her a chance, but she chose to keep lying, to hold on to her secrets. And that was all the confirmation I needed. The following weekend, when Claire left for another trip, I called a private investigator. I laid everything out, explaining the situation as neutrally as possible. He listened, then told me he could get me the evidence I needed, but it would take time. I agreed, knowing that waiting was my only option now. It felt strange, hiring someone to dig into my own life, but I knew it was the only way forward. Days passed, then weeks. I pretended everything was normal, even as the investigator sent me updates, small bits of information that slowly painted a clearer picture of her affair. I learned where they met, the hotel they frequented, even the times they'd spent together. The investigator was thorough, professional, and by the end of it, I had everything I needed. Finally, I was ready. I didn't plan a dramatic confrontation, I didn't want a scene. I wanted her to understand what she had done, to see the life she had thrown away with her choices. I waited until she came back from another trip, watching her as she unpacked, smiling and chatting as though she hadn't been lying to me for months. That evening, once the kids were asleep, I sat her down in the living room. She seemed a bit taken aback, sensing the shift in my demeanor. I didn't waste any time. "I know," I said, my voice calm but cold. "I know about you and Derek." Her face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. She opened her mouth to say something, to deny it, maybe, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said, my tone firmer. "I've seen the emails. The messages. I know about the trips, the hotels. You don't need to explain anything to me. I've got all the proof I need." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I almost felt a flicker of pity. But I pushed it aside, reminding myself of the lies, the betrayal. "Why?" I asked, more to myself than to her. "Why did you do it?" She looked away, her shoulders slumping as she struggled to find an answer. Finally, she whispered, I don't know. I didn't think." "Exactly," I interrupted. "You didn't think. You didn't think about me, about our family, about everything we built together. You were selfish, Claire. You threw it all away for what? A fling?" Her silence was answer enough. "I'll be filing for divorce," I said, my voice steady. "I've spoken to a lawyer. I'm prepared for whatever comes next." The reality of it seemed to sink in then. She looked at me, a mixture of fear and desperation in her eyes. "Please, don't do this. Let's work through this. I'll end things with him. I'll do anything." "It's too late, Claire," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." I left her sitting there, alone in the living room, the weight of her choices finally catching up to her. In the days that followed our conversation, Claire was a shell of herself. She tried to make amends, pleading, offering apologies and explanations, anything to make me reconsider. But I stayed firm, repeating that our marriage was over. Her desperation didn't move me, it felt hollow, like her sudden regret was more about the consequences than about me or the family we'd built together. The divorce proceedings moved forward smoothly. I kept it professional and to the point, staying as detached as possible. In a way, it felt like taking care of business, methodically wrapping up a project that had gone wrong. Claire was devastated, constantly trying to engage me in some form of dialogue, hoping I'd listen, but I'd already tuned out. There was no need to rehash things that couldn't be undone. A few months later, the house felt strangely peaceful. Claire had moved out, taking only a few things with her, leaving most of the memories behind. I had primary custody of the kids, and life resumed a different but manageable rhythm. I'd redecorated parts of the house, swapped out furniture, even changed some of the wall colors, little things that helped make the place feel like mine. It was a quiet, subtle reclaiming of my space and my life. One evening, as I was sorting through some final paperwork for the divorce, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Claire, handwritten, the envelope neatly addressed. I hesitated, debating whether or not to even read it. But curiosity won, and I opened it carefully, my eyes scanning the familiar loops of her handwriting. "Dear Thomas," it began. "I know you'll probably throw this letter away, but I hope you'll read it first. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and there are things I need to tell you, things I couldn't say in person." She went on to apologize, explaining that she had felt lost, overwhelmed by the mundanity of life, and had drifted into the affair without thinking. The words were expected, predictable. But then she added something that made me stop cold. "There's something you need to know about Derek. He's not who you think he is. He wasn't just a fling. There's more, and I know it's too late to explain, but I need to tell you the truth for once." The letter continued with details about Derek that I hadn't been aware of, things she'd kept hidden even during our arguments and the divorce proceedings. Apparently, Derek had been someone from her past, a connection that had started years before we'd even met. They'd gone to college together, but circumstances had kept them apart. When they reconnected, she'd felt like she was reliving an old part of herself, and it was that sense of nostalgia and familiarity that had drawn her back in. But then she added a chilling twist. "Thomas, I don't know how to say this, but Derek, he has something of yours. He's been planning this for a long time, and I was a part of it, even though I didn't realize it at first." I read on, confused and uneasy, trying to piece together what she was saying. Then it hit me, Derek wasn't just some lover who'd happened into her life. He'd known about me, known about my career, my finances. She went on to reveal that Derek had been systematically siphoning money from our accounts for months. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I realized what she was telling me. This affair had been about more than just an escape or a distraction for Claire. It had been a setup, a con. The more I read, the more the pieces fell into place. Transactions I'd brushed off, withdrawals I'd barely noticed, they all came rushing back in a sickening clarity. Claire admitted that she'd willingly given him access to our accounts, though she hadn't known his full plan until it was too late. By the time she realized, he had already drained tens of thousands of dollars, leaving her entangled in a mess she couldn't escape. "Thomas," she wrote, "I've lost everything. Derek is gone. He took everything he could and vanished. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to tell you the truth before it was too late. Please, just protect yourself and the kids. I'm sorry." My hands shook as I held the letter, my heart racing. I felt anger welling up inside me, hotter and more consuming than anything I'd felt before. I had been played, lied to, and robbed by the very people I should have been able to trust. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theft, calculated and precise. As soon as the shock wore off, I acted. I contacted my lawyer and began investigating every account, every transaction. With each layer peeled back, the depth of Derek's scheme became more apparent. He'd used Claire as his access point, and together they'd chipped away at our savings, hiding small withdrawals under the guise of her business trips and expenses. He had manipulated her, or maybe she'd let herself be manipulated. Either way, he'd cleaned us out. A few weeks later, I received a call from Claire's lawyer. Apparently, Derek had also left her stranded, clearing out her personal accounts and vanishing without a trace. She was left penniless, with debts she had no way of repaying. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction at the thought of her facing the consequences, but it didn't make up for what I'd lost. In the end, I managed to recover some of the funds, enough to stabilize things for me and the kids. But the experience left scars, reminders that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken and difficult to rebuild. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new kind of normal. Claire tried reaching out a few times, leaving messages that I deleted without listening to. She was part of a chapter one had closed, a chapter one was determined never to reopen. One evening, as I was putting away some boxes in the attic, I found an old photo of us, Claire and me on our wedding day, smiling and full of hope. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange mixture of anger and sadness. Then, finally, I set it down, turned off the light, and walked away, ready to leave it all behind.